What's happening, bakers? This is Nick. You're watching Bake Bread Instead, and today I'm going to talk you through something I've seen discussed on the internet with various degrees of success for different people, but I've found to be quite a reliable method of making an overnight bread that's delicious, has a lot of flavour, a really good crust, and is simple and straightforward. This is the old dough or pâte fermentée method, but without the addition of any new yeast in our recipe. So we're relying purely on this old dough and the yeast inside of it to get our new dough started. Worth mentioning that I've only seen this work once. Once you've used an old dough to make a bread, you should bake that whole new dough rather than trying to continue the old dough. There just isn't enough power to get it going a second time round. So what I'm doing here is taking around 150 grams of old dough. That's a lean dough, a standard dough. I think it was 80% white, 20% wholemeal, but so long as it's lean, that means it's not got additional milk or eggs or fats or anything that can go rancid. It can really be any mix of flours, because what we really want from the old dough is its yeast content and the flavour that comes from its fermentation. We're adding 150 grams, as I said, to around 350 grams of new, fresh, cold water. We're building a standard dough of 70% hydration on top of our existing old dough. The only thing we're doing is removing any additional yeast from our recipe. So this would be a standard recipe for a 70% white dough. I'm mixing that old dough through the water to make sure that any yeast inside it is integrated with the liquid that we use to hydrate our new flour. That's important because we want an even rise, so we need to make sure that anything that's in that old dough is evenly spread through the new dough. By whipping it in this way, we sort of give ourselves the best chance of making sure we get it well integrated. And once we're there, grab some scales and measure out 500 grams of strong white bread flour. This flour is around 13% protein. We're using a separate bowl to do this because we're going to mix our salt and flour together before adding it to our water. We've only got a limited amount of yeast inside that old dough, a limited amount of rising power for our bread, and salt can really stunt that. So by mixing it through the flour first, we're essentially diluting our salt content and making sure that we're not harming our yeast before we start the bread rising. Give it a quick stir. You could use a whisk for this. I'm just using the handle of a spoon. And once you feel you're there, once you feel that things are properly mixed and the salt is evenly spaced throughout the flour, you can add it to your liquid. And don't worry here about just pouring it on top of the liquid and the water in your bowl. This isn't like a dough where you'd need to build some kind of well and add bit by bit by bit, because as you'll see when we get to the mixing stage, we're really going to need this dough for some time and with some effort. That means there's not going to be any lumps. We're going to make sure that things are smooth and even and that liquid is properly combined with the flour that we've just added. Don't need to be dainty here, don't need to do it bit by bit. We're going to be kneading so heavily that tipping it in this way is absolutely fine. Give yourself some space and tidy up your work surface because the next part is quite sticky and messy. Worth noting that alongside something to stir with, in this case a wooden spoon, I've got myself a plastic bench scraper. A bench scraper is essential when you're working with doughs of a higher hydration. If you go in there with just your hands, it's going to get very sticky, it's going to feel like a completely fruitless task, and the parts where you need to detach the dough from a table will become almost impossible. It just won't come up. A scraper allows you to push underneath your mass of dough and lift things up, get a pull, build some tension, fold it over without getting too caught in the weeds of working with your fingers, getting messy and frustrating anyone else in the house when they start finding dough on the handles of cupboards or anything you've had to touch while your hands are absolutely covered in gunk. And in terms of where we're trying to get to in the bowl, I just want to make sure that anything in there is part of the dough ball. So you can see me really pushing into the sides here and trying to lift up as much flour as I can before tipping out. We don't really want to add a considerable amount of flour after this point. I'll use a limited amount when I'm working on the bench and I'll dust here and there. But it's important in terms of consistency of recipe that anything we put in we get into our final bread. So that's why I've spent that extra time really scraping everything off here, using my dough scraper to get it off the spoon. I just want to know that what I've measured out is what I'm putting in the oven eventually. So when we get to that point of having it pretty much all into the dough ball, we need to start working it and kneading it. Some recipes with this much water in them won't actually do a bench knead. they rely on things like stretching and folding or other methods of building gluten within the dough ball to get that work done over time. But because we want to make sure our old dough, our only source of yeast, is properly mixed through, kneading like this is a far more reliable way to make sure that happens. If we were to just rely on stretching and folding, well, we might build gluten in the dough, we probably aren't getting an even dispersion of yeast, and so we're not getting an even release of gas, and we're not going to get an even final crumb. I'm going to fast forward this bit because I spent around 7 or 8 minutes kneading here, but I can talk about some things that are worth keeping in mind. Number one is having a good expectation of what you're going to be dealing with and what dough feels like when it starts to come together. This is quite high hydration. It's not massively high, but it will feel wetter because of the old dough, which is already elastic. That means that, as you can see here, things are really sticky on the table. If you've not worked with this kind of dough before, it can feel fruitless or impossible. So knowing what to expect and knowing that it will start this sticky, as you can see, and my hands are moving through it almost like it was butter, there's no real sense of cohesion here. Knowing that that's the starting point and knowing that it will get better keeps you on track and saves you from becoming too disheartened. Number two is knowing that a bench scraper will save your life with these kind of doughs. So I've got one here. I've got a kneading hand and a scraping hand. So I've got one hand that stays quite clean and is responsible for scooping up and bringing the bread off the table so I can rearrange it and sort of keep it as a ball rather than letting it get stuck everywhere it comes into contact with the wood. So that's my scraping hand, and my working hand is my right hand here. So you can see I'm just again pawing and clawing through the dough to stretch it, pulling it over on top of itself and then scooping under to make it back into a ball. That process will repeat for several minutes before things start to feel more cohesive. The third thing I'd mention is that I am trying to keep a downside when I'm working this dough. So you'll see that every time I lift it up, I'm turning it back down on itself so that as I'm stretching, there is a side that is getting pulled more. That is the side that keeps getting turned back onto the table. This is easier to illustrate with a stiffer dough, but it has the effect of building shape and structure from the kneading stage onwards. So obviously we'll shape our bread later, we'll give it a pre-shape before we give it a final form and put it in a banneton. But by doing what I'm doing here, it's working its way into a ball. If I was to be more random, if I was to just grab at the dough, while it would eventually get stretched, the gluten would form, it wouldn't really come to a ball. It wouldn't be easy to transfer back into its bowl. We wouldn't have something that already is a little bit shapely. So you can see at this stage now, it is starting to look a bit like a dough ball. And as I work it and pull it and keep turning it down to that downside, it's coming together. Let's skip on. Now, around 6 or 7 minutes more of kneading and we have something that looks like this. It's still very sticky, it's still quite wet, but it has a lot more shape. And at this point, we can start to think about getting it ready to do its first rise. We do have one more shaping step in the bulk ferment process. That's a stretch. One stretch and fold will just bring it from this sort of shaggy, uneven dough ball into something that really has tension on top and is smooth and is what we would expect from a lower hydration dough or a dough that didn't have so much pre-fermented dough within it. Before we get there though, we need to get this ball back into its basket or bowl where it's going to do its bulk fermentation. So you can see here that I'm now just about able to do the kind of dragging shaping you might do to form a boule or a round loaf of bread. And as it comes away from the table, I'm just going to flump it in there. We don't want to waste, we want to get everything that we measured out back into our dough, so you can see me pulling things off the table. And then once we've got it all in there, we're just going to cover it up and leave it to rise for around 1 hour or so, 1.5 hours. Just enough time to get some relaxation so that we can pull some tension into it. I'll show you what that looks like now. Notice that the dough has expanded and relaxed. While it's somewhat wider, it hasn't risen at all. There's not been enough time passed in that 1 hour for that small amount of yeast to do much noticeable work. But it does feel softer. There is maybe some gas forming after that time. What's important though is that because it's relaxed, we can now use a wet hand to do a stretch and fold. You can see as I turn it over, there are some signs of fermentation in there. That's good. That means that our old dough is doing its work. I'll take that off. I'll go and wet my hand. Then I'll come back and start a stretch and fold process to form the dough into a ball. I've mentioned this in some other videos, but if you're ever struggling with sticking, one thing to keep in mind is that wet doughs respond well to wet hands. They're easier to handle with wet hands, which is why I'm using cold water here to pull it from the sides and pull it over itself. Whereas a drier dough, you might find that it was a slightly floured hand or a hand covered in something like cornstarch or potato starch that would serve you a little bit better. Dry doughs are easier to handle with dry hands. Wet doughs are easier to handle with wet hands. At this stage, we're just giving it the very initial shaping and stretching that will pull in some tension on the surface. This is kind of like a pre-shape, but as part of the bulk ferment. So we now have something that will sit like that. It's nice and smooth on top. It's still sticking a little bit, but I'm not too worried about that. Remember that I said earlier we don't want to add any extra flour, and by using just a tiny bit of moisture on a wet hand, we haven't changed the recipe at all in this process, whereas if you were to try and do this by flouring the table and by flouring your dough, you would be adding quite a considerable amount of flour to the recipe and stiffening it up and drying it out a little bit. That's not something we want. Okay, that's things done until the morning. So we're going to put our water away, we're going to tidy up our surface and come back to see how things are in around 10 hours or so. In the morning, I came down to this well-risen, beautiful looking bit of dough. So this has all the signs of being well fermented. It has risen, there's visible pockets of gas. It's considerably larger than it was and puffy. It still has some structure at the sides. It looks domed. That's a good sign that things haven't over-fermented, that we've not had a collapse. So much like a sourdough, this has taken around 8 or 9 hours at room temperature to do that bulk fermentation. That's way longer than you would expect from a commercially yeasted dough. But it's much easier to maintain old dough, which can sit in the fridge for 2 weeks without any input, than it is a sourdough starter. And the results, as you can see here, are quite similar. Let's tip it out, get things in shape and transfer it over to our banneton to do its final rise before going in the oven. Unlike our previous shaping stages, where we were being very careful not to add extra flour, at this point and from this point onwards, we're going to be using flour and eventually potato starch to make sure that things do not stick. The difference here is that there's no longer any meaningful mixing happening to the dough. All the air, all the structure of the dough is already in there, and this final shaping process has two jobs. It's a sort of stacking process where we build layers of structured dough on top of each other by rolling, and it's also a tension building exercise so that we can have that oven spring where after our score the bread wants to push open and push outwards towards the sides of the bread, springing things up. So you don't want to handle too aggressively here because, as I mentioned before, the structure that we need in our bread is already there. You can see it as we look down on this sticky side here. The lacing is not something we want to flatten out of our bread. However, these big air pockets that you can see around the edges are things that we probably will burst during this process. Once those big pockets are out of the way, we need to give our bread its shape and tension. As I said, those bubbles, those little micro bubbles throughout the dough, they're there to give it the crumb, and the shaping and tension building side that we're doing now, that's really there to ensure a spring. And so long as you don't pull so much tension into it that you crush that crumb, the more tension the better. So we've done a fold over and a fold from the other side, and now we roll. So we turn the thirds in and then we roll one side over the other as many times as we sort of reasonably can without breaking the dough. In this case here, that's 2 or 3, but if you've got a very extensible dough or not, as the case may be, you might only be able to get 1 or 2 turns before things get too tight to work with. So again, just rolling and rolling and rolling, tucking under and pulling some tension in there. All being well, you should still see some medium-sized bubbles where the air is being forced out, so you'll notice them towards the ends here, and that's a sign that there is still some larger pockets of air or gas inside your dough structure. If it's totally flat, if it goes back to being sticky, you've probably overhandled it, and you'll need to give it some more time to rise back to a point where it will bake properly and give an open crumb. What's important is that this final rise gets to that stage again. So you can go too far, but it doesn't mean it's irretrievable. Just give it longer in the basket. I'm tucking things under. I've used a little bit more flour to make sure that things sort of behave themselves. I've found that tucking the ends under like this helps the dough keep its form throughout the baking process. If there's open ends, the dough wants to push out and unfurl around those. So I'm just sort of tucking things under and keeping them tight. Once we do get to the final form, I have one last step that I like to do that helps prevent sticking, which is the use of a starch. In my case, potato starch, but this could be cornstarch. Some people use types of flour that do not form gluten, things like rice flour. But something like that is a good idea if you're going to let it sit in a basket for some time, because flour alone will take on the water of the dough and it will start to form gluten. Gluten is sticky. Sticky things will stick to wooden baskets, and so something other than flour is a good idea if your bread's going to sit in the bread basket for some time. A sieve here will help you get an even distribution of starch across your dough. You could do this by hand, but once the starch is on there, it really almost immediately sort of dries out the surface, and when you handle it, you'll start adding wrinkles and weird creases that wouldn't have happened before the starch was added. So I try and use a sieve to get a nice even spread without overhandling. But when I got to this stage, I sort of felt that the dough was still too slack or too lax, and I wanted to build just a little bit more tension. So taking it in its long side, stretching it out just a little bit more, I just felt like it would benefit from another roll. So that's what we're doing here just before transferring to the basket. Again, going through that stage of tucking and pulling. This is a judgment call. I just felt like it was too relaxed and I wanted something firmer in place before I transferred over. So this now is neat and compact. It looks about the right size and shape for the bread basket on the left there, whereas before it kind of just looked like it was spreading out still. I wasn't happy with it. So you can make that judgment call. For me, I wanted to build more tension, which is why I've done another roll here. A little bit more dust, a little bit more twisting and pulling on that seam at the bottom to make sure that it's really held together. Gas in a loaf of bread wants to take the path of least resistance out when you bake it. When things get hot and it expands, if there's an easy way out, it will take it. We want it to push out through the score that we put in the top. But if the bottom is the easiest way out, that's where the gas will go and the bread will sort of dome up or mushroom up. So that's what that pinching exercise at the end is there. That's just to make sure that things are properly glued together and sealed up. That won't work once you've starched something. It won't work particularly well because the starch will prevent the dough grabbing to itself. So try and do that on a surface that hasn't been heavily starched. After that, all we need to do is wait. So I think I gave it another 90 minutes or so covered in a bread basket before putting in the oven. I'll not make you sit through that. Let's skip on. And getting things ready to go in the oven just requires some kind of flat surface to transfer our bread onto for scoring and then sliding into the oven. Now, a great thing for this is a pizza peel, but I realise not everybody has that. However, a thin chopping board or a wooden chopping board is a great substitute for that, so long as we have some kind of flour or non-stick component to make sure that the bread that we've got in the basket doesn't stick, because there's nothing worse than getting to that stage where you're going to put things in the oven, you throw the peel or your chopping board gently towards your cooking surface and the bread just wobbles and sticks. So I've used semolina here, but you could use again more starch. You could use just plain flour because it's not going to be sitting for a very long time. Don't go too heavy if you're using flour because that leaves a taste to the base of your dough. Get ready to turn things out by putting your flat surface on top of the bread basket. A little squeeze, a little sugar might be required here if it doesn't come away easily, but mine did. Don't ever get too forceful trying to get bread out of a bread basket because it will deflate and tear. Squeezing the sides and working the sides is far better than throwing it down in the hope that, you know, momentum will carry it out. That almost always ends badly. Be gentle getting things out, and you 9 out of 10 times can manage. A lame here would be ideal, but I've just got a sharp bread knife because I'm going for one simple score. Make sure it's sharp. Cut at a 45-degree angle towards yourself through the bread, the whole length of the bread, and just making sure that those ends are cut to so that the bread can open from one side right through to the other. I'm just checking there that I've gone deep enough and far enough, and also that there's good crumb structure, because when you make that slash, you actually get a sense of what's going on in the bread. And if you look closely at mine, you can see that things are looking kind of as you'd want them. There's big bubbles, there's small bubbles, there's signs of stretching. These are all good indicators that the bread is going to work well, that it's well proved, and the fact that it's sprung open like that means that there's still a bit of life in it, that we haven't gone too far in our fermentation. So these are all good signs. And we add it to the oven with a tiny bit of water. So you can see I had a spirit measure there. That's 50 milliliters of just plain water that goes into the oven alongside the loaf of bread to create steam. Our baking time is 35 to 40 minutes at 220 to 230 degrees Celsius. That's on the conventional oven setting, not the fan setting. We don't want to blow that steam towards the door. We want it to sort of permeate right through the oven chamber. And after that bake, you'll get something like this. Now, yes, the cut and the break there is a little bit irregular, but you can see how delicious that crumb structure looks. This bread came out of the oven crackling. I wish I'd had a good way to record the sound, but if you've done it right, you'll have a very crispy crust that sort of breaks and pops and crackles as it cools. And that's it. That's how you make bread using only old dough. This is what you can expect it to look like, and this is how the crumb looks when you cut it open. It's open, it's springy, it's spongy, it's a good combination of large and smaller holes, but this was really, really delicious bread. If you haven't tried baking bread using only old dough, I encourage you to give it a go. It takes a while, but as an overnight loaf, it's perfect and the rewards are outstanding. So let me know how you get on, and I'll see you in the next one. Like this video if you're going to give it a try, and leave a comment if you've got any questions about baking in this method.